So I'm going to share my slides, and I have set PowerPoint so that it is producing automatic subtitles, and sometimes the transcription is very good and sometimes it's not so good. But one of the things that learning technologists have told us is how important it is for people who may be hearing impaired or for whom English may be a second language, that actually the transcript can be helpful. So I've started to try to do this with all of my slides. What I'm hoping to do today is to try to address just a couple of big questions about public communication of science and technology. And one of them is the research question, which is how does having some science knowledge or hearing about science influence the actual decisions that people make, especially about politically charged issues like abortion or climate change or vaccines, just to pick a topic at random, or personal issues. And again, of course, you can look at vaccines as being a personal decision as well as a policy decision. But the question is, does knowledge actually matter when we're trying to understand how people make these decisions? And once we've had some sense of that, then we want to look at the question of how can scientists most effectively actually interact with and engage with publics. Notice that I just said publics. When I originally wrote this slide, I said engage with and engage with the broad public. And one of the things we know from communication research is there is no one single public. There are many publics, and they form and they reform at various times in various ways. You can think about the fact that most of us know only a little bit about diseases like cancer or diabetes. But if somebody in our family gets cancer, or somebody in our family is diagnosed with diabetes, suddenly we learn a lot more. So that's just one example of how things can change. You learn things, you forget things, different contexts, people respond in different ways. And most of what I'm going to talk about today comes from 3 reports that were produced over the last 3 years by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in which what they were trying to understand is how does the public encounter science? What actually are the ways in which people engage with science? What perceptions do they have of science? This is the knowledge and attitudes question. And then finally, what should we do? What are the priorities going forward? Now, these studies were deliberately designed to be written by scientists for scientists who are not specialists. So they can sometimes be, they are less detailed than many of us would expect in a scientific paper. They are intended for broad and easy use. All of them can be downloaded for free from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences website. The whole program is called the Public Face of Science Initiative. So this was actually their second report, but I think it makes more sense to deal with it first, is what they called Encountering Science in America. And what they wanted to know was, where do people actually see science? How, especially things that are identified to them as science, right? We see science all around us all the time. The technology we're using is a product of earlier scientific research and so on. But where do people see things that are labeled or identified as science? And what they found, the top 3 takeaways, are that there are many, many places, and I'll show some examples in a minute, where people can engage with science in a variety of ways. It's not just through the media, for example. But that we don't know a lot about exactly what the impact or the effect of that is. There's a lot of social science research that is still needed. If I don't remember to say later on where I think there might be some neuroscience research needed, ask me in the questions. We'll get to a later slide where I want to mention that. But that ultimately the key issue is to understand people's motivations. And that understanding that is both critical for understanding what people do, but also critical for understanding what we as scientists can do if we want to reach people. So I know these slides are a little bit, these images are a little bit small. Don't worry about the details. You can get them in these downloaded reports. But the key things are to see that can you see my cursor moving around? So in the upper left where it says visiting science, that over 50% of the American public goes to a science or technology museum with some regular, goes to a zoo or aquarium rather. The science museums are much lower, about 20 or 30%. But something like 60% of Americans go to some kind of informal science education institution at least once a year. And that has been steady for the last 20 years. So this is good news, right? Sometimes it's a zoo, sometimes it's a natural history museum. This does include public libraries being a place where people can get a lot of information. People also attend science events. These are science festivals, which in number, there are now dozens of them around the country. These are often a week devoted or 5 days. This is, of course, in the days when we could all get together. Attending a week of lectures and outdoor demonstrations and town halls and conversations. And what's interesting there is first off to see what percentage, where do people fit on an income distribution? And it's the sort of 50 to 75,000 is the peak, but the number of people above that middle is definitely higher than that below, right? So that we don't have as many of the low income people attending. And similarly, if you look at the racial and ethnic background, again, you see that whites are overrepresented compared to African Americans or Hispanics or Asians in the population. Asians may be close to their presentation. If you ask, do people participate in science, for example, in citizen science? This was an astonishing number when they found this number, that about 15% of Americans say that they have participated in some kind of data gathering project, a citizen science project. I, by the way, will tell the editors of that National Academies report that you referred to it as the Bible of the field. They will be very pleased to hear that. About 3% have participated in some kind of online data gathering project, 2% in the maker movement. This data is now also a few years old. So what we see is that people can engage in a variety of ways. They also turn to the internet for news about science or information. They get a lot of their news from social media, and over time, less and less from traditional newspapers or radio or television. Lots of people, of course, are listening to podcasts. But part of what this is documenting is that for people who have as much gray in their beard as I do, we still tend to talk about the media as though it's newspapers and magazines and radio. And that just is not where most of America, including most of us, get our news, right? We get it from the web, we get it from our telephone. Now, maybe those are showing us the pages of traditional media, but still the way we interact with it is different, and so on. And that's worth being aware of. What was the first report, but the one I want to spend the most time on are what what are perceptions of science that people take away from those various interactions? And the first one is that the confidence in scientific leaders has remained quite stable over the last 30, 40 years. Scientists routinely come out at the top of people in society who are widely respected. Now, trust in all groups has gone down over the last 40 or 50 years, but scientists have stayed at the top. So it's not an issue about scientists, it's an issue about trust in any kind of institution. But the qualifier there is that there's lots of variation in that overall confidence, and a lot of it varies based on age or race or education level, what part of the country you're from, what political ideology you have, and other characteristics. And finally, this issue about perception is there is no single anti-science population. Again, remember that I said there are many publics. There are many different reshaping groups of anti-science groups. So one of the ways you can see this, for example, is that on an issue like climate change, it's largely people on the political right who question climate change or question whether we should be taking social action. But if you look at an issue like genetically modified foods or vaccine resistance, many more of those people are likely to be on the political left. There are also pockets in different parts of the country. And so there's a very complex relationship here that we have to be careful that we don't make too many stereotypes and overgeneralizations. Now, I'll give some more of the detail of of the knowledge and attitudes and perceptions, but in order to do that, I think it's useful to think about three different models of science communication. These were presented by my colleague Dietram Scheufele from the University of Wisconsin. And the traditional model, the one most of us work with just intuitively, is what's called the knowledge deficit model. And this is the idea that we have information, we have good information, there's always uncertainties, but some things we know, and all we have to do is deliver that information, and that will change public understanding and perceptions. It's a lovely model. There's a huge amount of wonderful material that gets produced with that model, but it's wrong. It turns out that very rarely does just delivering information to broad publics change the reality or people's perception. And so that's been replaced with a second model that we might call public engagement with science. And this is a two-way model. This is scientists can present information, but then they hear back from the community, from their audiences, about what their community's concerns are. And then that changes what information they present. Sometimes it even changes their research agenda. And this is part of a conversation. So, for example, take something like the development of a coronavirus vaccine. We know in this country that the disease has hit communities of color much more than white communities for a variety of structural socioeconomic reasons. But we also know that those communities, especially the African American community, are highly suspicious of the medical establishment because of historical legacies of experimentation that have been done on the African American community, most notoriously the Tuskegee syphilis experiment from the 1930s to the 1960s. African Americans are simply unwilling, many of them, to not only to take a vaccine, but even to be part of a test community for testing the efficacy of these vaccines, which means that we won't know whether there's anything systematically different about how that community responds to the vaccines, even though that's one of the communities that most needs a vaccine. Public engagement is about having that conversation and saying, why do you resist? here are the things, and scientists then responding with, here are the ways in which we are protecting against that, and here are the reasons why we want to recruit you. And engaging in a conversation and finding out what the concerns are, and doing that as a routine process. There's a variation on the public engagement model which addresses explicitly the political context. The fact that none of this happens in isolation, that science is fundamentally embedded in politics, and politics is fundamentally embedded in science. And you see that in social decisions about whether to invest in cancer or in the space race or in vaccines or in heart disease, right? Those are political decisions, given that we never have enough resources. And so there's always competition between groups. That's a political process, even within science. So the political dimension carries that aspect as well. Now, as I said, the deficit model is the default, the one that we've sort of used automatically. And it's based in this kind of data. This is data on people answering questions like, is the center of the Earth hot, true or false? An electron, is an electron smaller than an atom, or an atom smaller than an electron? Are the continents moving about on the face of the Earth, true or false? Questions like that. And these questions have been asked every 2 years, basically, since the late 1970s. So it's actually one of the best social science longitudinal databases we have. And what that data shows is that there hasn't been much change in the last 40 years. Right? This particular data only goes back to 88, so that's what, 32 years. But you can see that the numbers are about the same. About 80% of Americans, almost 90% now, or 85, so between 80 and 85% know that the center of the Earth is hot. About 70% know that the continents are drifting about on the surface of the Earth, what we would call plate tectonics. I'm sorry, that's about that's about 80%. About 70, 75% know that it's the Earth that goes around the sun, not the other way around. There's another set of questions that are lower, right? And those are things like the electrons versus atoms one, or humans evolved from other species, true or false, or the universe began with a huge explosion, true or false. The only one that actually goes up quite a bit is the question about antibiotics, interestingly, one that actually may be relevant now. From about 25% in the late 80s to about 50% now. The question is, do antibiotics are can be used against viruses as well as bacteria? The answer is false. That's actually the one I always have to look up to myself to remember. You'll notice there's some missing data. I'm going to come back to that. But fundamentally, this is the data that, that says to us the deficit model doesn't work, because over this 35 or 40-year period, a tremendous amount of incredibly good science communication has happened. Wonderful television shows and books and museum exhibits and so forth. And because it can sound like I'm being critical of them, I want to be really clear. That stuff has been, I mean, it's just wonderful creative material. And for those people who are engaged with it, it's wonderful. But it's not clear that it's addressing this deep concern about no change and how we're going to change that group of people who are getting less than 50% of the answers correct. Another question that's been asked during this period is whether people think that the benefits of science outweigh any harmful results. And again, the data is quite stable. It's about 70% going back to the mid 80s. And the number of people who think that the harmful results outweigh the benefits, that number's actually gone down from about 20% to a little below 10%. The number, and it's mostly been replaced by people who say that the benefits and harms are about equal. Now that's very broad data. And what happens is we want to try to understand that data in more complicated ways. And a lot of this work has been led by Dan Kahan at the Yale Law School. His degree is in law, but he's basically a social psychologist. And he's done a lot of work looking in detail at how we can understand science. And he uses something that he calls ordinary science intelligence. So what he wants to know is, what's the probability that you're going to get the right answer, depending on what percentile you are in what's called ordinary science intelligence. And the way that ordinary science intelligence is defined is partly about whether you get the right answers on some of those questions. It's partly about whether you can describe the scientific method, and in a variety of ways. It's not just the experimental method or the hypothetico-deductive method, but a few other kinds of questions, some evidence that you can do some quantitative reasoning, and some abilities using psychological measures to look at cognitive reflection and whether you're able to integrate all of this data. And what you see here is that if you ask the question, are electrons are smaller than atoms, which is true. I'm sorry, gotta get my cursor in the right place. The below average religiosity and the above average religiosity curves almost identical. If you asked what gas makes up most of the Earth's atmosphere, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, or oxygen, it takes a while before people start getting the right answer, right? You have to get up into the 50th percentile before people start getting the right answer. But again, religiosity doesn't really matter. What's the probability that a woman who tested positive in a routine mammography has cancer? Again, the religiosity is almost the same. Human beings, as we know them, developed from other species of animals. Suddenly we have a dramatic difference. People who test as below average in religiosity, which is measured by how important people say that faith is in their lives, combined with how frequently they go to some kind of religious ceremony or religious service. They're below average religiosity, people go up. Above average religiosity, not only is it dramatically different, but it actually goes down. The more ordinary science intelligence you have, if you are above average religiosity, the less likely you are to get the right answer. Right? There's something weird going on there. This is not just about your cognitive position. Hold on, let me make sure that I'm showing the right thing there. Oh, there we go. Remember that I showed that there was a gap in the data, right? That was the question about humans evolved from other species. And this is a study that's done every 2 years, sponsored by the National Science Board, which is the governing board of the National Science Foundation. And in 2008, there was a political dispute because the NSF is a government agency responsible to Congress. And because of that political dispute, 2 of the standard questions were not asked, the one about evolution and the one about the Big Bang Theory. If we were in a room together, I would ask you to say, can you guess why those 2 questions were not asked? I will remind you that the political complexion of Congress was changing in the late 2000s. And there was significantly more power from people who owed their election to people with strong religious, conservative, fundamentalist religious beliefs, for whom evolution is simply not an acceptable thought. And the idea that the Earth was created by something other than God also is sort of not acceptable. What you can see is that it's not, so you see in this data now, again, the overall trend, people get the right answer on the evolution question, but if you divide it by religiosity, it goes down. But, and here's the social science piece, If you add to the question, according to the theory of evolution, human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals, first off, everybody, the correct answer goes up much faster. That is, you need lower, less, you're in lower percentiles of ordinary science intelligence and you're getting the right answer. But second off, the patterns are actually quite similar for the above religiosity and the below religiosity. And what this means is the people for whom religiosity is important, they know the right answer, but they don't believe it. They're not able to deliver that when they are straight asked. So when they're specifically cued to the idea of the theory of evolution, then they get the right answer. So again, this is evidence that something funny is going on. Now, this can be a little bit complicated. Creation Evolution Headlines is a website run by a creationist group. And I had heard that they had a story on there about Bill Nye, criticizing him. Bill Nye happens to be a Cornellian. He's very proud of having gotten his degree at Cornell. So I went to go look at this article about him. And I discovered that on their homepage, there was a quote from me. Now, it turns out that this is rotating. Every time you load the page, another quote shows up. But largely, these are quotes from mainstream researchers that can be interpreted in some way to support the position of creationists. So in this case, I said knowledge and belief are not the same thing, using that data I just showed you. It might be politically useful for the scientific community to pretend that they're the same, but it would not be intellectually honest. Now, I do believe that, but it's really interesting to see how the subtlety can be taken out when it's used there. So a lesson for me in remembering how to do this. You can do similar analyses on many other topics. In the interest of time and the difficulties of giving Zoom presentations, I won't give you a lot more. Just this one other one. There's solid evidence of recent global warming due mostly to human activities such as burning fossil fuels. Again, if we look overall, there's an increase. The more ordinary science intelligence you have, the more likely you are to get the right answer. But if you divide this one by politics, liberal Democrats go up very quickly, and conservative Republicans again go down. It's really important to look at that trend that goes down. The more ordinary science intelligence you have, if you are a conservative Republican, the less likely you are to get the correct answer, or what most of us who are scientists would call the correct answer. Again, this tells us that it's not science knowledge that's at stake here. Something else is driving people's knowledge and attitudes. So when you summarize all this, and again, this is a table from that American Academy's report, what you can see is that you can't see. That is, there's no real clear pattern here, right? So are childhood vaccines safe? Ideology or party doesn't make a difference. Age makes some difference, but not the huge amount. Education doesn't make a difference. Gender doesn't make a difference. Your race or ethnicity makes a big difference. Remember what I said about experimentation on communities of color. We don't have data on religion. Is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? Age doesn't make a difference. Race, ethnicity, a little bit. The big one here is level of education seems to make the most difference as to whether people think that it's safe to eat. Is the Earth warming due to human activity? Now it's ideology or party and age that make the difference, and the other things are lower. All of this is showing us that the answer is it's complicated, right? We don't have a clear answer. All we know is that these things matter and we need to do a lot more. And so the third of the reports issued by the American Academy, which was issued just earlier this year, lists priorities for the future. And some of them are research priorities and some of them are action priorities. So their first priority is that the scientific community does need to commit to effective science communication. And some of that means things like putting resources into engagement. Some of that means things like higher education institutions giving incentives for faculty members to be and researchers to be involved in public engagement. Many of us who are at research universities are expected to produce research, and that's really the only thing that matters for promotion. Maybe we should be changing some of our policies in higher education. A second priority is to change the narrative. And the issue here is that we should be talking about the fact that we should not be claiming that science has all the answers. Scientists often the deficit model approach is often, here's the information, here's the answer, we have the answer. The narrative is, here's how we're addressing these problems. Let's engage in a conversation about which problems you want to see addressed and how we can best do it and why we're supporting this and what other questions you have that we might be addressing. And some of that, does involve then investing in things like science journalism. And then the final priority is to not just build the capacity, but also to develop some systematic support for science engagement. So that involves scientific societies and government agencies and universities actually building the networks. It means networking. It means connecting institutions. So if there's a zoo in one community and a natural history museum 30 miles away, get them connected so they can share resources. And so when a scientist agrees to talk at one institution, they might be invited to the next one. Or these days, in the days of Zoom, other people get invited into the talk as well. And the final one is the research one, that priority 3, goal number 3, standardize and increase the number of resources for assessing outcomes and long-term impacts. Just delivering the information isn't good enough. Just having a good engagement isn't good enough. We have to learn how to assess these things and figure out what's going to work best. So what's the lesson from all of this? First, that I can't emphasize enough that the deficit model is dead. Just delivering information is not going to get you there. That's not what the problem is. Instead, we need to rethink what science is, think about it not just as a body of knowledge, but also as a very complicated social process that involves politics and institutional competition and personal values and commitments and so on. And make that be part of the story that we tell about science so that it demystifies science and it makes science something that many more people can find themselves engaged with. And having taken science off of its pedestal, then we need to communicate with communities in this two-way engaged sort of way. Okay, so this is how I would kind of like to end the talk, except that it's clearly a problem. So this is a tweet that came out, this was in March, just as all hell was breaking loose on the pandemic, in which Nayo Hatta, who's just finished her PhD in environmental communication at the University of British Columbia, she tweeted, "The deficit model of science communication is bunk." She knows that, right? But she also knew that public response to COVID-19 would be much improved if everyone had a better grasp of exponents and logarithms and flattening the curve and all of those things. And this is what's so frustrating to those of us who come from a science perspective is, yeah, we get the evidence that says just delivering information isn't going to work, but wouldn't it be so much better if people knew the information? That's a conundrum. I wish I had an answer to that. I don't have a complete answer to it, but I will try to, in the last couple of slides here, give something, and hope we have some time for conversation. How does science knowledge influence the decisions of individuals about science policy issues? It's complicated. Sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's age, sometimes it's gender. There's no single answer to that question. And it's going to depend a lot on the particular issue and on the particular place and community that you're talking with. And given that, the question is, how can scientists most effectively communicate? All right, religion and partnership matters. So what should scientists do? You need to talk to communities. Don't fall back on the deficit. It's so easy to say, here, I've got information. Don't do that. Stop. Listen to the communities that you want to be communicating with. Listen again. Stop. Process what you've heard. Then go listen again. Just sort of repeat this process. And then after you are reasonably comfortable that you understand the issue, what the concerns are, then you need to respond to them. Not just repeating what you came to say in the first place, but really having listened, respond to the concerns that people have. You know, and you can be personal about it, right? You concern about water quality in your area. You know, I have kids too. I want my kids to be able to play in the stream, or I'm eating the same food. I'm going to the same grocery stores, right? It matters to me too. You can do that. You have to engage with communities, and you have to do it early and often. This is not something you can do just at the moment there's a crisis, because you have to build a relationship, because ultimately it's about trust and relationships. I forgot when we were back there a few slides back, I wanted to mention the neuroscience piece, right? A lot of this is about how people are processing different aspects of their personality. This is where I hope people in your program and your department can help us answer those questions. And answer, why is it that building relationships is what happens? And that's where trust and understanding of values really comes from, is building relationships. I'm not always clear. I'm not always sure that I've made the point. So let me say it one more time. That's really what you need to do, is build relationships. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to answer whatever questions in whatever time we have. I will stop sharing so that I think you probably got the main thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewenstein. This has been a lot of insights. So I invite the audience to ask the questions. We have one comment on the chat. First of all, I really enjoy, I like your, putting the caption. Of course, you have a pristine English. So I think that will be something that we'll definitely try. We have a comment from Dr. Firat, which says that the difference seems to be knowing what the science is saying versus believing what the science is saying. Do you agree?
Yes. So the issue here is that knowledge is not the same thing. So there's knowledge, there's attitude, and there's behavior. And what we don't really understand is where belief actually, typically social science researchers will talk about knowledge, attitude, and behavior. First you have to have knowledge, then you have or attitude, and then that will lead to a certain behavior. And what mostly we think of belief as being in the attitude bucket. It's not clear whether that's actually the right place for it, because that would equate belief with other kinds of attitudes like trust or values. It's very interesting. I actually had a conversation earlier today with someone who's getting her PhD in entomology at Texas A&M. She had been an undergraduate at Cornell, and she was calling me back to ask me about some things. And she was talking about working with communities, agricultural communities, and talking with them about the details of certain kinds of choices they had to make about protecting against insect problems. And she said it was clear that they understood the science, but then they would say, and ultimately it's up to God, so we're not going to do anything. And coming from the Northeast, she's not used to that, the kind of deep religious commitment that people in other parts of the country may have. And so we're trying to figure out, is it belief? Is it trust? Many of the researchers would say it's trust that's more important than belief, that's ultimately where you have to go. But it's certainly not knowledge. That's clearly not the key thing.
And I'm wondering, we have at least one philosopher in the group. Dr. Guzman, do you want to comment on this?
Oh gosh, I have so much I'd love to say. Thank you, first of all. Thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you, Dr. Lewenstein. I did my dissertation on feminist philosophies of science and their intersection with epistemology. So this is very much in my interest. So one thing, I guess, is that when we think about knowledge, attitude, and behavior, belief to me, and this is just anecdotal, this is just me, I haven't done any real research or anything about this, but when I think about the ways in which people sort of make sense of their actions or behaviors or the choices that they're making, belief and trust are sometimes interchangeable. They don't, I mean, they might be conceptually different, but the way people respond to those things almost seem absolutely the same. So this is why you would have people who are very much, how would I say, they're very embedded in this idea, which is interesting. The idea out of which that first model for communication comes from. This view that science is very specialized and it doesn't get involved. It's a one-way street, right? Science can do stuff for public, but anything from the public will just mess it all up. And I find that that's another reason why people they don't want to build a relationship. They just want you to sit there and listen, right? But that's not how it is most of the time. But I think about people who are very vocal now. So Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, among others, they do have that view. I saw Bill Nye 2 different times, one here at this university and once at USF where I was doing my doctorate. And he made it quite clear he was disgusted with people who didn't have this particular view.
Yep.
And you do that in Florida, and that's a big boom.
Yeah. No, so I mean, a couple of different points there. I should say I like Bill. He's come and talked to my classes.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
But I agree with you. I don't actually fully agree with the way he approaches, especially in recent years. So one is recognizing the way that values can work for you. So at one point I was evaluating a citizen science project, and one of the sites was in Florida, and this was a bird watching project, and it had been adopted by a lot of homeschoolers, and we didn't quite understand this because the whole point of the project was to show how evolution works. It was gathering data to show it had to do with different color morphs of pigeons. And there's actually an interesting evolutionary question that trying to understand how those colors maintain themselves. But a lot of these homeschooling communities that were adopting this were fundamentalist Christian groups for whom evolution was simply not an acceptable explanation of what we see in the world. And so as we were evaluating, we asked, why are you participating in this? What do you get from this? And what they said was, this project is about observing nature. This project is about showing and acknowledging and observing the grace that God has given to us, right, and the beauty that God has given to us. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of those places where the values, in doing it for different reasons, and yet the value of observation and of detailed observation of the natural world fit comfortably in both. in both value systems. And this then gets to the first thing you mentioned, which is the ways in which belief and trust, although conceptually different, probably operate in some ways similar. And that quote I showed about knowledge and belief being separate. So the person who for many years ran those surveys of science literacy, he was furious with me for that quote. Because what he said was, if you don't get the right answer on, let's say, the evolution question, then you don't truly understand evolution. This is not about your belief. If you really understand evolution, then you can't answer that that it's not true. Yeah. So this is another example of this place where we have to, I think as researchers, we have to figure out how do we cross these things? How do we, things which we can see conceptually as different and yet in practice they operate together. I'm not sure, again,
Well, I don't even know if I asked a question. I was just really interested by what you said and thinking about belief and trust. I just feel like I could sit and chat about all this all the time. That'd be fun.
So I will be interested, this is Sheen Ward, and I will be interested in knowing if, like for all the neuroscientists among us here, if there is a different part of our brain actually get activated when it comes to the belief part of our being, and then the scientific knowledge, the pure cold knowledge, involved knowledge part of of us, that's like from a different part of the brain. I think it'll be interesting to know that.
Yeah, I know that there have been some science communication researchers. So science communication research is a slightly odd field, right? You have to have done that constant jumping the way I did. And it's got mostly it has two origins. Partly it comes out of a science journalism world where people were interested in media and how media institutions work and how media covers certain topics. And part of it comes from an informal science education world, so really about learning. And neither one of those fields is particularly biologically oriented. And so there hasn't been a lot of, for example, fMRI studies of which parts of the brain are activated in this kind of thing, at least not that have made it into the science communication literature. Maybe they have been, maybe in your fields you actually do know of these things, but I think this is a place where we need to learn more. I myself am a historian and a sociologist, so I'm certainly not the one to be doing this or even understanding it. And actually, to the degree I'm a historian of science, I'm actually somewhat critical of some of those methods. But that doesn't mean they're not valuable, right? We just have to understand how to use them well.
May I ask?
Please.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm a Cornellian. So you have at least one in the audience. My question is, you've sort of developed a universal prescription for all of science. That's what we should do. My question is, I've never had a course in astronomy, for example. So even though I have a PhD, etc., anyone who took an introduction to astronomy course in college knows a lot more than I do about that. So I guess my question is, should there be different prescriptions for different areas or types of science?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So a different talk, the other talk I was thinking of giving today is a much more detail about those models and much more detail about the differences between deficit model and public engagement models. And the conclusion of that talk is you have to mix them, right? Because you can't have good engagement. Let's say, for example, NASA once did, a few years ago, did a project on engaging publics in the policy decision of what should we do about near Earth objects, that these asteroids that might or potentially could collide with Earth and be, you know, catastrophic if they did. And rather than just having the experts involved, they brought in communities. So you can do it in astronomy, but of course they had to first educate deficit model the community members to make sure that they understood what the choices were, what trade-offs were, what was technologically capable of, and so on. So in fact, you have to have some information delivery in order to do engagement. So that suggests, one, that you do have to alter the balance for different fields in different places, right? So if you wanted to address a water resources problem in South Texas, you would have a different conversation than if you wanted to address that problem in upstate New York, right? Because we have different technological situations, geographic situations, amount of rain, so on and so forth. So there'd be different balances. And again, it would depend on which audience you were working with. But the idea that you're going to have to both have information delivery and engagement and conversation, that would be the universal piece. And so that's why I say it's yes and no, is yes, in any given situation, you're going to have to make variations. But the overall principle of combining some information delivery with some engagement and doing that in a context where you've been building relationships over time, that's the universal piece. That's the piece that's going to apply in any kind of situation.
If I may, I'm not afraid of saying things that make me look stupid, but I have to throw it out there. A fascinating subject. And I just wanted to put in there, I think possibly part of the overall principle that might be making our communication more difficult, and this is my perception in over the last few years, I feel like political correctness is a huge problem because people are afraid to speak freely, and there's punishment for saying what you think. And so I think that shuts down an ability to have an open, honest dialogue with people. And I think also to the point that Firat made, knowing what science is saying versus believing what science is saying, I almost feel that part of the scientific community is responsible for some of the forcing to believe what science is saying mentality, because by virtue of our publications, you have to have an answer, you have to know the outcome. And I think that's disingenuous, and that the scientific community has brought that on themselves. Yeah,
so I'll address the second piece first, right? So this is part of scientists being reflective and understanding what it is they've actually achieved, and finding ways of talking about the uncertainties in what you know. You know, obviously we saw this in the mask problem early in the pandemic, right? Where the subtlety of don't wear a mask because we need the available masks for healthcare workers got lost in a don't wear masks. And as the knowledge became clearer that it's not about touch, it's about aerosols and droplets, well, initially droplets and then eventually aerosols, you know, yes, it actually does help if you wear a mask in various ways in both directions, right, as to whether you're going. Those are subtleties that, because we have presented science as if it always has the answer, it's harder to talk about the subtleties. So this does mean that we have to learn how to talk in subtleties, and that's hard. We don't have good ways of doing that. We have to, and that means that some of that goes all the way down to elementary school. We, you know, not presenting science as always having the answer. One of my colleagues, Trevor Pinch, wrote a book, sort of an introduction to thinking about science as being a social process. And he talks about the elementary school experiment where everybody has a little burner and a pot of water and a thermometer. And you want to find out at what temperature does water boil. And Rosa has 98.7 degrees, and Nora has 100.7 degrees, and Stephanie has 99.9 degrees, and Christine has 100.1 degrees, and you get a whole bunch of these. And I'm sorry, Camille, but you only got 92.7 degrees. And so now you have to explain, okay, so actually the boiling temperature of water is 100 degrees, and you can see how they cluster, folks, and there's a little variation. And Camille, there must have been something wrong with your thermometer, so we're just going to throw out that data point, right? But the reality is nobody measured 100 degrees, right? If you actually look at it, nobody actually got 100 degrees. So part of what has to happen is not smoothing out the uncertainties, making it clear that we're going to agree on 100, but it's because we're agreeing, not because that's exactly what the data showed us, right? Except in a certain more sophisticated kind of way. So if we get to that sort of richer understanding of what science is and how it operates, I think it will be easier for us to deal with nuance. Now, to get to then, Cordelia, your first point, which was the political correctness, we can't always say what we want, we can't always talk about the uncertainties or the reasons why we do things, right? That if you're an environmental researcher, often you have a commitment to a certain understanding of the environment. Or if you're a cancer researcher, often it's because there's a personal connection. There's somebody in your family had that. And that emotional piece is not sort of allowed in the conversation. And depending on the audience that you're speaking with, the message that you have might not be a welcome one, right? So again, if you're in a conservative location talking about evolution, or in some places mask wearing or whatever, or if you're in a liberal place and you're talking about GMOs and vaccines. And so part of what happens then is this is where, one, having built a relationship where people know that you are someone who is willing to engage in conversation helps you get past that. So it's not drop in once on your congressperson, it's drop in once a year on your congressperson and build a relationship over time and invite them to your campus and your city council person and your county administrator and all of those things. And do that regularly and build relationships. But it's also about having built those relationships saying, why are you worried about this? What is it that is leading you to this position that my work says is not the right answer? And I'm trying to understand that. So, and that's the conversation piece, but you can only do that if you've built relationships. And in our current political environment, those relationships are hard to build. Absolutely. I'm as guilty as anybody else of not wanting to be in a room with people who have opinions that I find really difficult. Sometimes I have to force myself to it.
Thank you. May I have a question? Thank you very much. That's very fascinating.
Dr. Salom is our chair, the chair of the department.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gladys. So, this is fascinating, and really you are kind of putting science within a political context, and all what's happening is telling us that, science is very hard to see it as something isolated in an ivory tower. Just the whole discussion about the mask, that's very simple things. So, I am wondering whether, just building relationship is going to be enough, when you have all of these, like tremendous interests, like, I think political positions are not simple, just positions. you have tremendous forces at hand.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what science to do, you know, in that.
Yeah, so it's not going to be simple. But part of it is us as scientists accepting that the politics is part of what we do and is built into what we do. As scientists, we often like to pretend that we're not, that our science is separate from our citizenship, from our membership in our communities, and so on. And this is why I think I referred briefly to the real process of science, not the idealized thermometer in the bucket one, but the one that says we have to smooth out data. And we sometimes have to throw out data because we have a reason to suspect it's not right. And to recognize that part of why there is more funding for certain kinds of health research is because, why is there a separate Institute of Allergy? Because a very powerful congressman had really bad allergies. And so had enough political power to say, we're going to build a separate institute, even though from a logical point of view, it would have been built into one of the other existing institutes. So why we have the national institutes, plural. That's not because there's a scientific reason, it's because there's a political reason. And we have to accept that. That's not, we don't live in a world where there are infinite resources. There are always going to be political decisions, and we have to acknowledge that and work within that system. Just as we have to acknowledge that when we work at universities, there are internal politics to a university about which department gets resources and which department gets more students, and that sometimes we don't make decisions just for resources. So, many departments of humanities are in trouble right now, right? Because students are choosing sciences or business for economic reasons. And yet many of us who are part of an academic community believe that the humanities are fundamental to the kind of thinking and questioning and shaping of the world that is why we think academics and education is important. So we might choose to give resources to the humanities departments, even though they're not the ones generating the tuition dollars that are paying for it all. But that's because we have a collective and we have decided to allocate resources around, that sort of thing. We have to acknowledge that as scientists, that that's part of the work we do. We have to acknowledge that learning how to present your work clearly, the communication, and not just the public communication, but the communication to your colleagues, being able to do that better and learning how to do that better, not just sort of doing it on the side, but actually spending time learning it, that's going to improve your ability to do research or your ability to succeed in the pharmaceutical industry or the chemical industry or wherever it is you're going, or the IT industry, depending on where you're going with your work. If you're going into medicine, your ability to communicate with your patients is going to improve your skill and your ability, which, by the way, will also be about building relationships.
So, Dr. Lewenstein, you have mentioned and give a lot of preponderance to building relationship. And we know that personality and previous experiences, particularly adverse experiences, affect the ability of somebody to do that. And we have a resource center to empower younger faculty, meaning junior, not necessarily younger, but junior faculty from minorities population, from minority backgrounds. And this is definitely one of the things. Do we need processes to empower a minority faculty at, institution across the country, but here it's, urgent. How can do we need processes? You said establish the relationships, but there is no recipe for this, and we are interested in really becoming, a true model for this, how to empower these early investigators and to facilitate for them the access to the communities that are also underserved and that we need into research and to, among other things.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This requires institutional commitment of two kinds. So the first is to have an office or a program devoted to building the relationships. So at Cornell, about 5 years ago, one of our generous donors said, I would like every student to have the ability to have the opportunity to go out and do some kind of community engagement as part of their educational experience. And he gave tens of millions of dollars, I think it was $50 million, to establish this program, right? This is not a little program. This is a big program. And the university, of course, also had to put in some of its own existing resources. And that program, the people in that program help build the connections, and they have workshops for us on how to build better connections. And they have checklists for us of things to make sure we do. And we can get funding for them to pay for the bus to take people to the community, or for students to take a bus out to the community, and so on. Because it takes real resources. It's not something you can do on the side, right? Now, those of us who are not in the program full-time, it's another resource for us that we can turn to, just like we can turn to a learning technology center or to the registrar's office when we need help with the bureaucracy or the advising office. There's the engaged Cornell office, right? So that's part of it, is that kind of not trying to do it on the side, but having some people for whom this is what they do, is build those relationships and work with other people who are trying to learn how to build those relationships.
I think that's a wonderful advice. We, the communities that where we are, one of the poorest in the nation. And in some of the counties, it's 99.5 Hispanics, 60% of them, underinsured or uninsured.
Yeah.
So we want to communicate in a way that matters. And we have been learning and found the promotoras, the community health workers program, one of the ways in which they bring us to the community. Mm-hmm. And they ask us.
Yeah.
So we go to the community to support their programs, whatever, but it's basically they are asking us what to do, and they act as an interface.
Yeah.
Sometimes is, a lot of our faculty do not speak Spanish, or, just because even though our, the language might be not the barrier, but the complexity of the language and all that. So they translate, even in the same language, English, they translate to English if it is English speaking, or if I'm speaking to Spanish, they will rephrase things in a way that they really know how to make it understandable and also believable for the people.
But part of how they do that is because they are in the community. They have built those relationships. And so if they've built a relationship, then when they bring you in, you're not starting from scratch. They're helping you with that relationship, including some of the translation, as you say, sometimes from English to English. They have it's the fact that they've built the relationships that allows them to then have you there to help provide information, and for them to remind you to be listening to what the community has to say. But there's another piece that I wanted to add besides this sort of dedicated program, which is that the time you take to go to the community needs to be credited. There need to be incentives for you to do that, because when you're doing that, you're not preparing for class, you're not running your laboratory, you're not doing your committee work on the undergraduate service, curriculum committee. All of us in academia have to deal with these things, right? And so there needs to be a real commitment that says, when somebody takes the time to build relationships with the community, and that does take time and it does take effort, they get credit for that. And that means that we don't expect them to, is it teach, or is it we don't expect them to do as much research, or we're going to give them leave from some of their administrative responsibilities. We're going to give, if they're really good at it and they build a good program, their raise is going to depend on that. They're going to get credit on their raise for having done that. This is hard. This is a real culture change for us in academia. So it may be easier for a school like yours, which by its organizing principle is intended to be in a community and serving a community, in a way that my elite research university isn't as good at, right? Because we are literally up on a hill and up in our ivory tower there behind me on the on the screen. It's not ivory, it's stone. And actually, you can't. This picture is not the year they did it. About 20 years ago, a few days before Halloween, we all woke up and there was a pumpkin stuck right up there on the top of that spike. Nobody has ever admitted to getting it up there. Some rock climber went up the side there. Anyway, but this is a change in academia, and it's one where, unfortunately, and these are the politics of academia, even schools that are intended to serve their communities tend to look to the Cornells and the Harvards as, well, that's what we want to be like, right? Even when at the same time that they're saying that's not exactly what we want to be like. And so it's on us. It's on those of us who are in these elite institutions to be changing the culture, to make it so that other people can see that that's an acceptable way to do it. But one of the ways we can do that too is when schools that are not like us, schools like you, who are in a different kind of social context and political context and geographic context, tell us, this is what we need. This is how we need to operate our schools in order to serve the communities that support us. Because if we don't have our community support, then we're not going to succeed at anything.
No, definitely. And one of the points that we are particularly exercising is to meet the person where the person is. And for us, this means not only the individuality, but the Hispanic culture is collective. So the family as a unit and the neighborhood as a unit. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to understand how can we dialogue about aging or Alzheimer's or running, or in a community and in a neighborhood that is scared. It's very scared,
Yeah.
And that is confused, that do not trust. But how can we talk even about identity when your identity could be a sign for a target?
Yeah. Yeah. So, this is critical, recognizing where people are and the cultural context of where they are, and in some cases, the legal context of where they are. I assume that some of those students you have are undocumented. you know, that makes it complicated for certain kinds of interactions. But also this identity piece, the sort of cultural, the collective identity, the commitment to family, the idea that that's part of how you define what's important and what counts. I was just talking to somebody a couple of days ago she was an immigrant from the Philippines, and she is supporting her mother, her father, her 3 younger siblings, her niece, and that defines what she does, right? And she's choosing not to pursue some opportunities because they would interrupt her ability to support her family, and that is more important to her. So I think we do need to do that and recognize. And you used a phrase that said we have to meet people where they are. So in 1987, one of my very first publications, I said that we needed to be listening to the audience, no matter where they are. And the great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov it got published in a sort of newspaper that was for scientists. And Isaac Asimov read this, and he sent a letter to the editor, because my article had been called "The Arrogance of Popular Science," that too much popular science deficit model was aimed at people who are already interested in science. It wasn't aimed at people who are not already connected to science. And he said, he said almost in this many words, "I don't understand who this Lewenstein fool is and what he's saying, because he's telling me I have to be where people are. And if people believe in magic crystals, do I have to be stupid like them? If people are believing that copper bracelets are going to cure them of cancer, do I have to be stupid like them? By Newton," he said, "not by God, by Newton. I would rather be arrogant than stupid."
Wow.
With all due respect to the late Isaac Asimov, I think he was wrong. I think we have to be where people are, and we have to understand. And it's hard. This is one thing. It's very easy for me to say. It's very hard for me to do. I'm not claiming this is easy, but
our favorite resident is psychiatry.
Hi, I'm Camille. I'm a 4th-year psychiatry resident, and I have a lot to say, but I will get it like very short. I will be wrong and I will be right in what I'm saying, because that's basically the world. Neurobiologically and philosophically, my point is building relationships can be a first step in reaching basically the world, but I believe that kind of eventually, if we are going to reach something good, I think that would be practically impossible. And I will explain that simply neurobiologically and philosophically. I think philosophically, science wants to reach a truth, an ultimate truth. And I think that's everyone. Psychologically speaking, we need to believe. And a belief kind of reduces the chaos that's in our heads. So I need to believe I'm a man, because if I'm confused, for example, I'll be very much confused, and I need an identity. So I need to believe. And with that comes belonging. And with that comes something that I don't think that we've discussed enough, that is emotion. And emotion, and I think when you're discussing that, and you're discussing this person that sent the letter, you are very much kind of having emotions towards this person. And these emotions are guiding also your belief. And everyone has emotions about their belief. And also add to that the insight and how much I'm ready to understand other beliefs because of my emotion and because of how strong this belief is in me. And that is why, psychologically speaking, we might reach, like, grab this with the identity. I think that's practically impossible to kind of build a whole unified world. Biologically, also neurobiologically, I think decision-making is always a yes or no, whether, I mean, bringing down to its narrow kind of smallest particle, it's always a yes or no in our heads, like whether this or this, this or this, this or this, which will bring poles naturally. it will definitely bring poles. And with that comes the belief and insight and emotion that will kind of draw the poles also away from each other. Last but not least, what I always thought as a step to kind of try to show how practically impossible it is to find one truth amongst, like right now we're 19 participants. If we all can try to believe one thing to be absolutely true, I highly, highly, highly doubt that. Highly doubt that. And I think this is the main reason why this is practically impossible.
So I don't completely disagree with you. So I have argued, so there are a set of deficit model type people like Bill Nye, like the experience that Dahlia described earlier, who argue that they're specifically speaking about evolution, and that the problem that religion poses for believing in evolution. And say all we have to do is get people to think rationally. Now, my understanding of human evolution is that I believe that every society that has ever been identified has some kind of belief in some spiritual presence. I haven't verified that, but certainly most of them do, right? Which suggests that we have evolved to have some kind of spiritual need, so to make us whole, to make us be able to hold on to that. So it's not a matter of just changing the way we teach people things in school, and suddenly everybody is going to become a rationalist and not a believer, right? Because for exactly the reasons I think that you were saying, we've evolved to have a need for belief. Similarly, with the general issue of emotion, one of my stock lines is that it is as human for us to be emotional as it is for us to be rational. And you're absolutely right. Emotion has to be part of this. We have to think about that. The place where I disagree is thinking that it's not worth trying to nudge a little bit in that direction. And that we can build systems to help us deal with the fact that emotions are going to drive us in a certain direction, and that belief is going to drive us in a certain direction. And I use that example that I gave earlier of the homeschooling kids, for whom observing nature contributed to their deep faith. But at the same time, it made many of them really good observers. And some number of them will choose to emphasize that part of their lives. You know, Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, has fundamentalist Christian beliefs. He doesn't find a conflict between them and his role as the director of the National Institutes of Health. Right? It is possible to find ways of combining these things. So we have to look at those ways we can nudge. A colleague who thinks about climate change has said, you know, how can we get people to take action on climate change? It's not when a scientist goes out and gives a talk, it's when a priest or a pastor goes out and gives a talk, because they know how to give a sermon that builds their congregation to a pitch and then says, and this is what we do. And so what you do is you find pastors who are perfectly willing, you know, who do believe in science, and you say, what's the sermon that you construct to talk to people about the beauty of Earth and the fragility of Earth and the interconnectedness of the Earth, and therefore the need for us to take action to preserve that, right? That to use that sort of religious emotional pitch. Again, this goes back to the earlier point about our belief and trust intersecting, right? So these things. So while I agree with the sort of underlying reality that you're talking about, I think it's possible to nudge us in ways that will achieve some of the goals that that we have.
And definitely we are gonna think about it and try to nudge towards that direction. I think that this reflection has been wonderful, and I hope you had enjoyed your time with us. And thank you very much.